Welcome everyone to our monthly webinar series, a collaboration between Utah State University, University of Idaho, and also South Dakota State University. Some of our moderators that you commonly see here are myself from Utah State University, act as the sheep and goat specialist. We also have Dr. Melinda Ellison from University of Idaho, who works as the sheep specialist there, and Carmen, who is a county agent who works with us, who specializes and raises goats. Jaylyn Whaley is not on the webinar today, and she is from South Dakota State University and works as the field sheep specialist. And so we're trying to keep things tight to our production systems and invite people who are doing novel things and or can share quality knowledge with us. And we're really happy to introduce Clay today. I was able to meet Clay in person, and I'm excited to hear about some of his research that he's been doing at South Dakota State University as they continue to really pioneer new production methods in sheep science. And so I know Clay is from Ohio. He comes from a strong South Down operation and is active in the association. Currently a master's student, right, Clay? Or have you defended yet?
Yeah, my defense is coming up in a couple months.
Okay, well, congratulations and good luck. With that, if anyone has any questions, please write them in the Q&A portion of the chat. That helps us manage the questions to make sure we can get through as many as we see fit in the time allowed. Other than that, feel free to reach out to any of us for any additional questions, and we'll let you introduce yourself, Clay, and you can take it away. Thank you.
All right, guys. Thanks for letting me be here and talk to you guys today. I'm going to talk a little bit about colostrum and bottle lamb care. First, I'll give you a little bit of a synapse about myself. Grew up in Ohio, obviously. I got my undergrad degree at the University of Findlay. Majored in animal science. My family at home and I run a flock of South Down ewes. That production system obviously looks a little bit different than what most of you out here in the Western states do. But now I've been at South Dakota State for 2 years as a master's student. Had the opportunity to be involved in some different research going on here, as well as coach the collegiate wool team. So I've gotten a little bit more familiar with what things look like out here. So today I'm going to try and take you guys through everything that you kind of need to know as far as what it takes to successfully raise bottle lambs, and how to manage them well. So here's just a general outline of kind of where we're going to go with this conversation. I'll try and pause for questions between topics, but keeping in mind that we're going to try and keep this presentation shorter, closer to 50 minutes. I'll probably keep moving through them, and we'll answer your questions either in the chat or obviously feel free to email me with any of those. So we'll move into our first topic. And really kind of the intro to this is, does it pay to feed bottle lambs, right? This is kind of something that each producer needs to take into consideration. Obviously, we're going to have the added cost of milk replacer, usually around $80, maybe up or down depending on what methods you're using and what the cost of your milk replacer is. And then the other big thing that we need to figure in is time, and any additional equipment. Obviously, these sorts of things can be reused, so it's not on a cost per lamb basis. But one of the bigger things that I like to point out when it comes to bottle lambs that I think is often overlooked, is really the opportunity cost, or in other words, how much time you as a producer and money as a producer you have into getting that ewe bred and keeping all the maintenance inputs you have on that ewe for a year. Back maybe on the eastern side of South Dakota or further east, where we're running a lot of sheep in confinement, our costs on those ewes are around $70 a year, maybe higher, maybe lower, but kind of in that ballpark. So obviously we have a lot more to lose maybe than some of you out there that are running range ewes. where you're turning them out and you have very little input costs in them for the year. So the moral of the story here is, by the time we get done going through what it takes to successfully do this, I would encourage you guys to kind of pencil out what makes sense for your operation, and is the care of bottle lambs worth the added time? But for the obviously, there's 130 of you here, it looks like, and I'm going to assume that you didn't click on this webinar if you didn't think it was worthwhile. So we're going to go under the assumption that raising bottle lambs is something that we want to get into. So then the first thing that we need to think about is what lambs should we be putting or on the bottle, or what lambs are good candidates for being a bottle. Obviously, each place is going to be a little bit different, but some common situations or just ideas, food for thought of areas for you guys to think about adding lambs onto the bottle. Here at the SDSU sheep unit, we have polypays, so it's really frequent for us to have twins and triplets. But unfortunately, we've noticed that those triplets, ewes that are milking triplets, oftentimes don't really have enough milk to keep all those lambs going. So we opt to take that third lamb off and put it on the bottle. That lets our other two lambs get better performance, and allows us to, manage the third one a little bit more. That way we can maximize productivity or pounds of lamb that we get out of that ewe that year. Obviously, if you've got ewes that are rejecting their lambs, ewes with major health concerns like mastitis, maybe they prolapse, etc. Or if you've just got a dumb or a bum lamb that you need to keep moving along. Those are all ones that are pretty good candidates. I will say that the younger you start your lamb bottle feeding, the easier it's going to be to get them used to the bottle. If you let them spend some time with mom, it's going to really hinder their want to really suckle off the bottle. And again, you have a lot of time and resources invested in getting the live lamb on the ground. They are added work, but when they're raised properly, these can be profitable. Now, the first thing I'm going to talk about after we've selected our bottle lambs is the opportunity to draft or graft lambs on. If you have the opportunity to graft a lamb onto a ewe, I would very much encourage you to do so. And when I talk about grafting, I'm talking about taking a lamb that was born out of another ewe that we now have in the bottle lamb pen and getting another ewe to accept it as its own. Really good candidates for this are ewes that lose their lamb in the birthing process. Obviously, we want to, if we can get another lamb on her to suckle and keep her udder healthy, we want to do so. Maybe if you've got really productive ewes that can handle milking two, if they only give birth to one, we can put one on there. And generally, when we're doing this, we like to use ewes that have more maternal drive, maybe some ewes with some age on them. So the keys to doing this successfully is timing. The best time that you can do it is when that ewe is in labor. So what we have a ewe in labor that we know, okay, she's a good candidate to be a foster mom. So now we're going to take our bottle lamb. We want to really clean and scrub the lamb of salt water. Basically, we want to make that lamb smell, get rid of as much smell from that lamb as we can. And then the next step I call sliming. So we want to take any placenta, amniotic sac, birth fluids, rub it up against the lamb that she gave birth to. Basically, anything we can do to make that lamb smell like it's hers and make her believe that she gave birth to two lambs. And then the last one that's I think is really critical and can really increase your success rate when you're doing this is stimulating the cervix of the ewe. So basically what this means is that we're going to put a sleeve on. I would recommend, obviously, people pull lambs without those, but we want to reach in and we kind of want to pass our hand almost like a fist about the same size as a lamb for 10 to 15 seconds and make that ewe think that there's another lamb falling out of her. Once we remove our hand from the cervix, then we'll go ahead and present the lamb to the ewe, and hopefully she accepts it as her own. Now, once you put the lamb in, you want to watch closely and make sure that she actually does lick on that lamb. Once they kind of lick or bleat to the lamb, usually we're in good shape as far as knowing that she's going to take on those lambs as their own. Um, Red flags should be if you see her stomp, if you see her swing her head at it, anything like that. We want to go ahead and remove that lamb from that situation before that ewe can do any harm to it. Okay. I'm just going to keep moving through the questions here, just to try and keep us on schedule time-wise. So the first 24 hours are a pretty crucial time period when it comes to raising our bottle lambs, because that's when we want to get them colostrum. When I say colostrum, I'm sure many of you know what this means, but I'm referring to the first milk that ewe produces. Any milk that is collected from the udder within 24 hours of birth can be considered colostrum. It's really, really important for providing immune protection to the lamb. Obviously, it's got a lot of energy, protein, IgGs are huge. It also helps get their gut set up with good bacteria, gets them a healthy microbiome. It is really essential to get your lambs off to a good start. I cannot stress enough the importance of getting colostrum into your lambs. Now, bear with me here. I go through a lot of scientific, information here that sometimes can be hard to digest. I'm going to do my best to keep it in layman terms as best I can. If I start to sound like the teacher from Charlie Brown, I apologize. Hopefully, I don't put anybody to sleep as we do this. Feel free to put questions in as we get going to that, and that'll let me go back and explain things if they aren't fully understand the first time. So IgG, right? You saw I had it highlighted on that last slide. It's really important for the passive immune system to protect the lamb properly. It's really important for that lamb being able to actually have an immune system when it gets out into the world. And the lamb can only absorb it within the first 24 hours that it is on the ground. And I'll talk a little bit more about why that is. Yeah, again, can't beat around the bush enough or say it enough. Lambs need colostrum. If they don't get it, they're really, really going to struggle. So the timing of colostrum. So what I have here is just a diagram of what the gut wall looks like. When that lamb is born, all of these cells on the gut wall are specialized in that they can take in whole proteins, whole large molecules like IgG into the lamb. Once that lamb is fed, the body says, all right, we need to start closing off this cell wall, or we need to start closing off this boundary because we don't want things like bacteria or viruses or any sort of disease also coming in, right? This is only supposed to be here to let in the IgG. So what happens is once that lamb gets its first feeding, these cells start to grow, and we'll end up replacing all of these cells within the first 24 hours. So once they get that first feeding, the clock is ticking on how much time you have left for them to be able to absorb the IgG. So it's really, really important that the first milk that they get is colostrum and not some sort of milk replacer. Because once we lose this first layer of cells, we're done collecting IgGs. That's moral of the story right there. Like the first 24 hours is when this really needs to happen. So you hear me talking a lot about colostrum and IgGs and why they're so important, right? So if we think about our lamb inside of the ewe's uterus, right? It's living the good life. It's kind of like this bubble boy. The sheep's uterus is got so many layers in it that nothing can really get into the lamb. So the lamb hasn't seen any sort of bacteria, viruses. I mean, you name it, anything that can cause that lamb harm in the environment, the lamb is pretty naive to it. It has no immune system to protect itself because it hasn't encountered any immune challenges, right? So what the IgG does is serves kind of as that lamb's passive protection, for that lamb to be able to combat those things while its immune system figures out okay, what's friend and what's foe as it encounters all the things of the world outside of the womb after it's born. So you keep hearing me talk about IgG, so I think it's really important that you guys get a good understanding of what IgG actually is. So this is IgG right here. It's a large protein molecule. It's actually an immunoglobulin, so it's a part of the immune system, and it has two parts. The first part back here is what communicates to the lamb's immune system. It tells the immune system, hey, whatever I'm stuck to is bad news. You need to come and clear it out. Really important for identifying friend versus foe, and giving that lamb an idea of what types of pathogens it needs to start building immunity against. Now, the other end of IgG is the end that sticks to the bacteria, sticks to the toxin, sticks to the virus when it comes into the body. Okay. This sticky end of IgG is really specific to just one invader. So when our body makes, or when the used body makes an IgG molecule, it makes an IgG molecule against tetanus. It makes an IgG molecule against sore mouth. It makes an IgG molecule against um, any disease that they're getting, Pasteurella. I mean, so this is incredibly specific to the diseases that U has encountered, right? Because the U's body is the one making these IgGs. So whatever challenges or pathogens or disease-causing agents that U encounters in her day-to-day life is what's going to get passed on to the lamb, um, with that high level of specificity. So keeping that in mind and understanding, I see we got a question pop up. Can we give colostrum from goats to sheep? Great question, Jana. Let me get through this slide and hopefully I will have answered that for you. So keeping in mind what I just talked about with the specificity of the IgG, the study that we did here, we looked at 4 different sources of colostrum to identify really which one is better, which one helps the lamb the best. So for us in South Dakota, we don't really have a lot of goats, but we do have a lot of dairy farms. So we opted to, in our comparison, we looked at colostrum fresh from the U, frozen colostrum. This is something that I would really encourage all of you guys to start doing if you aren't already. If you have a U that has extra colostrum, freeze it. You can see these are in nice cube shapes here. Those are just out of the ice cube tray. It makes it really nice because then you can pull out and you don't have to thaw out a whole batch if you just go, okay, I need a couple ice cubes. And then we can use this Shepherd's Choice colostrum replacer, and we use colostrum from a dairy farm. Now, keeping in mind what we talked about, right? The best way to give your lambs protection is going to be from your U base, right? Those U's are making IgG molecules that are incredibly specific to the problems, to the diseases, to everything that's going on and living at your farm and in your lambing barn. Those U's are encountering it and they're getting their lambs ready to deal with it once they get on the ground. Same story with frozen colostrum. If you can freeze colostrum from your own farm, it's really helpful in getting those lambs the specific immunity towards what diseases they're going to face on your farm. The issue, not that it's a huge issue, but it's not as with the cattle. So this powdered colostrum uses bovine or cattle sourced IgG, as well as obviously the dairy cows are making cattle IgG. The problem with the cattle IgG is that while those lambs are getting their IgGs, and you will see that in their bloodstream, those IgGs aren't as efficient as one using their sticky specific end to bind to the pathogens that your farm is encountering or those lambs are encountering. And then two, the label end that tells the immune system, that label end is labeled to tell the cattle immune system, hey, here's a problem, we need to clear it out. Um, how effective the cattle IgGs are at stimulating the lamb's immune system to, break down those invaders is not really heavily researched. Um, it's something that we're kind of working on right now. I wish I had some more results for you guys there. But what I can tell you from preliminary observation is that we had some lambs that we had given cattle colostrum to. I've run the tests. I know they had an adequate amount of IgG, but they still got sick and died from tetanus. And none of the other lambs on the trial died from tetanus. So that tells me one, either the cattle IgG is not sticking to the tetanus toxin, or two, it wasn't effective in telling the lamb's immune system, hey, there's a problem here. We need to break this down or it's going to kill us. So keeping that in mind, you can use colostrum from goats. I'm going to say that there's not very much research out there that says how effective the IgG is from a goat IgG to the sheep IgG is at signaling um, and stimulating the lamb's immune system to clear out those invaders. Um, but it's better than nothing if you don't have anything else. Um, what I've learned is the best thing you can do is these two right here. These others two, I would encourage you guys to treat as your backup plan. If you can't get colostrum from the U, or if you don't have any frozen on bank, then you have a bag of this laying around as your backup. But I would, again, I know I'm saying this a lot. This right here is the best thing that you can do for your lambs to help set them up for success. Yeah. So that in mind, now we are going to think about what we can do to increase our colostrum quality within our flock, right? How can we give the lamb the most amount of IgGs possible and the right IgGs to protect it? Oh, we got another question popped up. How much fresh versus frozen should the lamb get? I will answer that question in a couple of slides, I promise. So ways to increase the colostrum quality on your flock, right? We're trying to give the lamb the most amount of IgGs and the most specific IgGs to the invaders or disease causing agents that it's going to encounter, right? So one way that we can do that is by vaccinating the ewes about 40 days prior to lambing. What that will do is it'll allow the lamb's or the ewe's immune system, it's going to stimulate her to think, hey, I have a problem going on with this disease. I'm going to increase the amount of IgGs in my body to help counter this disease. And then what's going to happen is we're going to get more of those specific IgGs that go into the colostrum and are passed on to the lamb. Example, CD&T, really important, right? I talked about it on that last slide where we had the lambs that received the dairy cattle colostrum were dying of tetanus. We didn't see any of that in the lambs that received colostrum from our flock where we know those ewes were getting vaccinated with CD&T, not only early on in their life, but also later on. So then it kind of becomes up to your own discretion. And I would encourage you to talk with your veterinarian or your extension specialist about what diseases you have going on at your farm and what vaccines you should be using. I would say CD&T is one that everybody should be using. And then these are other ones here just to think about. Obviously, you all know your flocks better. You know your flock's disease history better than I do or anybody else does. So keep those things in mind. I see we got more questions popping up. How long can you store colostrum in the freezer? I'll talk about that. So if we vaccinate the ewes at 40 days prior to lambing, do we still give the CD&T at 60 days old or back that up at 90? Great question. You still maintain the same amount of or the same vaccine protocol you have going on with those lambs. This passive immunity that they're getting from the ewe lasts for about the first 30 to 40 days of their life. At that point in time, the lamb has gained the opportunity or the ability to mount its own response to pathogens. And that's when we can start seeing vaccines be effective. So, absolutely continue your vaccine protocols that you have in place on your lambs. Just in addition to that, consider vaccinating your ewes to help them with the first 30 days of their life because you're going to get more sustained immunity. These IgGs that the lambs get from the ewes, they aren't going to make any more of their own. They're going to taper off and leave the body as they start to make their own. So vaccinating them allows them and programs them to make their own IgGs. While we're on the topic of frozen colostrum, general rule of thumb with that, usually about a year is what I like to do. Obviously, if you have older stuff that you can use in a pinch, not a bad thing. But about a year, I think, is a good shelf life for colostrum. I wouldn't want to use it much longer than that. The other thing that's really important that we should talk about when using frozen colostrum is that thawing process, right? We don't want to put something like that in the microwave where that radiation that's cooking or getting things warm can damage your IgGs. The best way to thaw your colostrum is to put it in your bottle and then place that in warm water and let it warm up gradually. Slow thawing is a good thing. Rapid thawing or using the microwave is really likely to damage your IgGs, and you're going to lose that immune health, the immunological function of the IgG. So, how much colostrum do our lambs need? We've talked about it's important. We talked about what it does. My general rule of thumb is 1 ounce per pound of body weight at birth. So, example, a 12-pound lamb is going to get 12 ounces of colostrum. Now, there's a lot of people out there that will say that you need to do more than this. This is what we did for our study. It seemed to work. We only had that one lamb get sick from tetanus, or the couple lambs get sick from tetanus. Um, so yeah, general rule of thumb, 1 ounce per pound of birth weight. So, 12-pound lamb gets 12 ounces of colostrum. Now, it's really important that you don't exceed more than 5 ounces per feeding, right? Those lambs don't have a great big stomach when they're born. So we'll break that 12 ounces up into 3 or 4 feedings. If you have more colostrum on hand and you want to feed it more, that's great. Um, I like to, like I said, so the gut's going to be completely closed off um, in that first 24 in the first 24 hours. But due to that nature that I talked about earlier of that those cells gradually growing off, right? It's really you'll get better absorption if you get all of your colostrum in within the first 12 hours. Um, and the other thing I'll say, I really encourage is when you're feeding colostrum, use a tube. We want all of that colostrum to get into the lamb's gut. We don't want it on the face of the lamb or on the ground if it spits it out, right? It's really important that it gets it. And if it's not actually making it to the stomach, it's not going to be utilized. Um, Possible hypersensitivity reaction when feeding bovine colostrum to lambs. I have not seen any data that suggests that. I'm sure that there probably could be a case out there, but I wouldn't worry too much about it. We didn't have an issue with it when we did it here. And then is it possible to kill the IgG when mixing powder if the water is too, I'm gonna guess that means hot. Um, I would say, as long as you're not making your IgGs, or as long as your water's not, excessively hot, like boiling when you mix it in, you should be okay, right? A good way to think about this is like if when we're cooking an egg, right? Is the water hot enough to cook an egg? If the water's hot enough to cook an egg, it's going to mess up your IgG. But if you're putting your powder into 80 or 90 degree water that's roughly body temperature of the lamb, or like 100 degree water, you're going to be just fine. Okay. So we're going to talk a little bit about a topic that I think is pretty fitting for most people if you're in the South Dakota area right now. I know we talked about you guys probably are pretty cold out there in Idaho too. I'm sure Utah gets pretty chilly, and that's hypothermic lambs. Um, so once we identify, when it's really this cold, we want to be watching and making sure that we're checking on them pretty frequently. Here at the unit, when it gets below zero, we check every 2 hours. That way we make sure we're there. In case they hit the ground, they don't become lamb popsicles, right? So there's kind of three categories that I'm going to talk about hypothermia in lambs. So our normal lamb temperature, right, is 102 and a half, give or take a degree. So our mild hypothermia will classify as 99 to 101 degrees, and then severe hypothermia is 99 or less. So this is the lamb that we're temping right after it's born. If we come out and we find it and it looks cold, we'll stick a thermometer in it and see where we're at. So for the sake of discussion here, we're going to say that we came to the barn and we found a lamb that we saw in a state of severe hypothermia. It's got a temperature of less than 99 degrees Fahrenheit. What do we need to do for it? So at that point in time, that lamb has probably spent just about all of its energy reserves to keep itself warm and keep itself alive. Um, so what's really important is that we get that lamb's body some more energy to keep warming itself up with, and we do that by using dextrose, um, 20 to 25%. Talk to your veterinarian; they should be able to give you a good recommendation here. But we'll inject that right into the body cavity of the lamb. You can see here in this picture, we're going right in the rear flank area. I like to hold them upside down. I think it makes it easier to get the needle in there. Obviously, we want this to be warm. We don't want to put cold inside of a lamb that's already cold. So we want to warm it up to the normal body temperature of the lamb, get it in there, give that lamb the extra sugar and energy that it's going to need to stay alive and keep fighting to warm itself back up. The other thing that we want to do is use a warming box. I'll talk a little bit more about those. We want to get it that first feeding of colostrum, right? We're trying to give this lamb as much energy as we can. And then we'll take it out of the warming box when we see it get back up to that normal 102, 102 and a half range. For mild cases of hypothermia on our lambs, we're going to put the lambs utilizing things like a heat lamp. Here is this is a great place to use them. We might not be extreme enough that we need to go to the warming box. I would say my rule of thumb is if there's anything under 100 degrees, it goes in the warming box or in a heated office or something like that to help warm it back up. Again, we're getting at the colostrum, and then we can go ahead and take that heat source away once it gets back to normal temperature. I think we've got, so here's just a couple ideas for warming boxes. These don't have to be anything fancy, right? We made one out of a hair dryer in a cardboard box. Works just fine. The idea is that we want to lock the lamb, put the lamb into some sort of contraption where we can blow hot air across it and dry hot air to really warm it up. These heated barrels are something that a lot of people use. I would recommend these for those mild cases of hypothermia. The nice part about these is that you can keep the ewe in there with the lamb. Um, Again, knowing the situation is going to tell you which one of these you need to use. It looks like we've had a couple more questions pop up. Do you have any video tutorials that you can recommend to make me feel comfortable? I don't know if I have a good video tutorial, Lori. I'm sure maybe Chad or Melinda has one that they recommend. Um, what I've always told people is go slow when you're passing the tube and go on the right side of the lamb. You don't need to have the colostrum connect or the tube connected to the syringe. So if you're using one of those syringe, plungers to push your colostrum, what you can do is pass the tube with nothing on it, and you'll get it into the stomach. When it's in the stomach, you should be able to hear a crackling sound. Um, Again, when we do this, we don't force it down. We just nice and easily pass it down the right side of the mouth, and it should make its way into the stomach. Um, it's really kind of as long as you're taking your time and you're pushing it down slowly, you'll be able to feel it go down the side of the lamb's throat. It's really hard to push it into the trachea. Um, so just when you're doing it, take your time and go nice and slow. Lisa says, "Do you mix dextrose with water?" You're gonna want to mix it with sterile saline. So you'll be able to get that from the vet. Um, they come in big plastic bottles. I should include a picture of those on this presentation. But you will mix it with the sterile saline, not water. I would like to see more info about where exactly to inject the dextrose on the body cavity, sub-Q, right? So we're actually going what we would call an IP, so it's intraperitoneal, so it's not sub-Q. So the idea is that we're breaking through the body wall and putting it all in where the intestines are. I think that there is a really good extension article out there on this. I maybe want to say it was Ohio State. Don't quote me on that though. If you look online, just Google it. It should probably come up. If not, I'll be happy to make something and send it to you, Tammy. Okay. Continuing on, we're dangerously behind schedule. Okay. Other considerations for your hypothermic lambs. Dexamethasone is, I used to work with a vet that said no animal should ever die without first knowing the benefits of steroids. Quarter of a cc here, approximately, can help stimulate the lungs to get going and help the lambs get off to a better start. Obviously, a lot of people are probably seeing this NutriDrench. Again, the idea is we're just getting energy to those lambs. Same thing with the molasses. The other two things that I'll throw on here for consideration are this calf perk product. Basically, all this is just a lot of caffeine. So we're just, again, drugs to stimulate that lamb to help get it going. And then epinephrine is one that can be really useful, but you should really talk with a vet and get comfortable with using this before you get a bottle of it. This is the same stuff that they put in EpiPens, so be careful when using it. But I use it a lot. It's really effective if you got a lamb within the first hour or two of being on the ground that just is having a hard time getting going. About a quarter of a cc of this, maybe even less, like a tenth or 0.2 cc's of epinephrine can help, get the heart pumping and distribute the blood throughout that lamb and help kind of kickstart some of those metabolic processes to get it moving along. Okay. So we'll talk about now bottle feeding systems and strategies. I apologize, I'm going to pick it up and go a little quicker so that I can try and keep us to that hour timeline. So once we've given them our colostrum, it's time to start, right? So when we first get them going, a soft nipple is kind of ideal to use. Something that doesn't have a giant hole on the end that's going to drown them when they try and suckle. We want to feed them warm milk. And if you're using a feeding system, we want to use the same nipple that's going to be in our feeding system. So we'll talk a little bit more about what that means. The other thing that I'll talk about is getting a good milk replacer. This is really the best money you can spend when it comes to raising a bottle lambs. Buy something from a reputable brand. We use the Shepherd's Choice. It works really well. It's formulated. It has the right energy and protein for lambs. Using cow or calf milk replacer or whole milk from a cow works, but it really isn't getting your lamb all the nutrients that it needs. And then the important thing is once you pick a milk replacer, stick with it. Changing milk replace your lamb's gut is getting itself used to having the same milk every single day, right? If we leave a lamb on its ewe, it's drinking the same milk every single day, and it's really efficient at drinking that one milk. If we switch, we can cause some stomach upset and some other problems that we don't want to have happen. The other thing that's really important for bottle lamb is creep feed. We want to get creep feed into these guys early as 1 week of life. We want to make it really palatable. Generally, I recommend 18% crude protein, usually 5% fat, including ionophores like Bovatech, um, is really a useful tool when it comes to helping control coccidiosis. Again, that's going to be about less than 0.5% of our total ration. Um, Way to increase that palatability, we're using smaller grains, oats, wheat, spelt, cracked corn instead of whole kernel, mini pellets instead of regular pellets if you can get your hands on those. And you can increase the amount of molasses in your batch. Obviously, we don't want to make it sticky enough that it doesn't feed through the creep feeder, but making it sweet and taste good can encourage those lambs to start eating sooner. This slide just has a couple comparisons here of lambs that or of calves that were fed grain early on during their bottle rearing. You can see that this rumen wall is a lot more developed. And this is what's going to be helpful when it comes to getting those lambs ready to switch and ready to wean. If they have a ruminal wall like this, they'll be able to absorb food a lot more easily than if they have one of these smoother ones that doesn't have as much surface area. So then when it comes to raising bottle lambs, if you're raising a number of them, you kind of have two options. You can use a milk machine, so a self mixing. It allows for ad lib feeding. It's pretty handy once you get it set it up. It doesn't take much effort aside from you have to clean it a lot. The bad thing about them, they're kind of expensive. You need to have a warm area in your barn to keep them from freezing, otherwise they're going to break. Um, and obviously, doing maintenance on the machine if it goes down can be more costly too. Versus bucket feeding systems, we use those here at the University of unit. They're really easy to keep clean. You can feed a pen of lambs, works just about any pen setup, and they're really cheap to make compared to the machines. The only cons here is that you have to watch your buckets and make sure you're filling them up the amount of times a day, the right amount of times per day. Milk machine systems, here you go. I won't spend too much time here. Bucket feeding systems. Um, I'll talk a little bit more about these as we keep on moving here. Okay, I saw we had one question pop up. Maybe if I can get it to come down here. Is it equally important to pick and stick with the same creep feed? I wouldn't say it's as important as your milk replacer, but it's definitely important to keep the same creep feed throughout the whole time. Um, because again, right, your lambs are getting used to eating one food source. It'd be the equivalent of us being used to eating cheeseburgers and French fries every day. And then we go on vacation in Mexico and eat a bunch of food that's really spiced and peppers and, has a lot of different things in it, right? Those effects aren't always a good thing on the digestive system. So we don't want to be doing that to our bottle lambs. Goat forums caution against feeding creep and grain to bucklings and wethers. Do you have a common age to quit creep and grain feeding? So to not go down the tangent of why you don't want to feed grain to older male goats, feeding creep feed for your goats is something that you should be doing while they're nursing. Um, Obviously to about that 40-day age, and then I would recommend feeding grain until those animals hit their full mature body weight. Once they hit that mature body weight, then you can switch. Obviously it depends on what type of goats you're using. We can talk more about that too, if need be, after we make it through this presentation. So when we're doing raising bottle lambs, it's important we want to wean those lambs early, right? Our biggest cost is our milk replacer. So weaning early will allow us to cut down on that cost, and it will reduce any incidences of bloat or overeating disease. The goal that we should have in mind is to have the lambs off milk by 4 weeks old or 30 days. In order to do that, we need to be making sure that those lambs have free choice creep, free choice water, and then as they get older, we're going to start limiting their consumption. So I'll talk a little bit more about kind of the timeline of what this looks like as an early weaning strategy for bottle lambs. So at birth, days 1 to 7, right, we're giving that quality colostrum right away. We're going to put those lambs on a bucket with a soft, easy to suckle nipple. We want to have warm milk in front of those lambs all the time. And we want, um, basically, we want to get them going on the bucket, drinking warm milk all the time, free choice. Then at 1 week old, we'll make that transition to harder nipples. By this point in time, the lamb should have enough vigor. This will save you from having to change out nipples if they chew the ends up of them too bad. We offer them free choice creep at this point in time. And we also, again, we're still feeding the warm milk. Big changes here. We're offering them creep feed, transitioning to that harder nipple because they should have more vigor to suckle now. So at 2 weeks old, again, creep feed is still in front of them. Here we're going to offer them water, so we're going to put a bucket of water in there, and then we make the switch to cold milk. The lambs will still drink the cold milk; they won't like it, but we're trying at this point in time to get them to start thinking about stopping drinking the milk, and get them more interested in eating the creep. And then at 4 weeks old, we're going to go ahead and pull the milk away from them. Again, keeping the creep in front of them. Free choice hay can now be introduced, right? We saw that picture where that calf was offered hay and milk. It wasn't as developed as the creep. So really only offer them creep while they still have milk. Then once we remove the milk, then we can offer them the hay. Free choice water. The other thing that I kind of recommend is use of free choice baking soda. We don't want to do this for a long period of time, but maybe those 2 or 3 weeks after weaning helps them kind of be able to buffer their rumen out if they get a little acidic from eating too much grain. So with this method, this is what we used for my research trial. You should expect your weaning weights to be about 25 to 35 pounds. Remove milk replacer. That can be either advanced or delayed based off of if the lambs are really performing well. We can remove that milk replacer sooner. If we know they're eating the creep really well, we can take it away a couple days sooner. If we're still not sure how well they're eating the creep and they're a little bit slower growing lambs, we might opt to leave the milk in for a little bit longer. All those things can kind of be independent to each operation. Looks like we had a couple more questions pop up in the chat here. I'm going to keep on going, and I will promise I will answer these questions at the end. So this is what the early weaning schedule kind of looks like, right? These are all pictures, aside from this one, from the lambs on my trial. So week 1, we offered them warm milk with these soft nipples out of the Premier bucket. They worked really well. What we did was you can see here, we hung the heat lamp. Our lambing room is kept at about 20 degrees during the wintertime, and we were able to keep the milk warm by putting this heat lamp close to the milk and putting the milk in there warm. The lambs always had that access to free milk. Here, week 2, you can see we introduced a creep feed to them. Weeks 3 and 4, I made the transition over to these larger buckets. This heat lamp here is no longer here to keep this milk warm. It's here to keep this milk from freezing. So, the milk in here is probably anywhere from 35 to 45 degrees, right? It's cold. We don't want them drinking that. You can see we have free choice creep. The other thing, don't do as I say, not as I do here. We had hay in front of them. That was part of a university protocol. Somebody said that we needed to have it in there. So we did. But on your own operations, this is not something I would recommend while there's still milk, because right, we really want them to get their nose in the creep feed and start eating creep. And then our post weaning, here's all the lambs, right? We have free choice hay, and these feeders, free choice creep feed, and they're weaned and we're rolling. Okay. The last bit of information I'm going to give you guys right here, and then I'll go into question and answer, is managing your diseases that are involved with your bottle lambs. The biggest thing that you can do to prevent disease in your bottle lambs is keeping your stuff clean. Make it a part of your daily chores to clean and disinfect your feeding systems. Whether that's the milk machine or whether that's the buckets, clean them every day. Clean the lines, clean the nipples. Anything that has had milk touch it needs clean, right? If we set a glass of milk on out in the barn and left it there for 3 days, right, we probably aren't going to want to drink that because there's going to be a lot of other crap in it. Neither are the lambs. Keeping those things fresh is really important, and keeping them clean is even more important. Um, this here is chlorhexidine. It's really cheap. You don't have to use very much of it. You use like a splash of it every time you clean. This stuff is the best disinfectant I can recommend to use. It kills everything that your lamp, everything that it comes into contact with, bacteria, viruses, etc. It takes care of it all. So I would really recommend getting yourself a gallon of this. It's not expensive, like I said. Use it every day to fully clean your buckets, or your milk machines or your milk lines. Um, this is what we used on the trial that we ran here. Every single day, I pulled the buckets in, cleaned them in the sink with warm water in this chlorhexidine solution, and we were able to stay disease free. The other thing, aside from your milk handling systems, is your pens. A lot of times we make the mistake when we're raising bottle lambs. It's like, oh, we need to keep these lambs in a really warm area, right? Well, it's true that we need to keep them warm for the first week of their life, but if they're up to a good start, they should be able to stay right out with everybody else. Um, you know, keeping that the mistake we make when we want to keep them in a warm place is that we often find ourselves in a poorly ventilated place. If it smells like poop and it smells like pee where you're at, imagine the amount of ammonia that those lambs are breathing in even closer to the ground. So bedding their pens regularly and keeping them dry is really important to helping keep the lambs healthy, minimize your respiratory distress and disease. I've always said higher amounts of ammonia have killed more, or higher amounts of ammonia, right? That pee smell in our barn will kill lungs and give you pneumonia faster than cold air will. Obviously, we don't want our lambs out getting a 15-mile-an-hour wind blown on them all the time, right? That's going to make them sick. But if we can keep them out of the wind, it's not a bad thing if they're a little bit cold, right? All of the lambs on my trial lived in 20-degree weather and they were just fine. Ammonia, that is really what will cook your lambs' lungs really fast. And I'm going to go into questions. I do have some more to cover here, but I think that this is something that is not as important as what we've talked about so far. So I'm going to get through these questions, and then if we have time, I'll talk about those health concerns. Okay. I was told to keep milk chilled from the beginning so that they don't drink too much and milk won't spoil. So the disadvantage of feeding chilled milk from the beginning, right? That lamb is brand new to the world and it needs, that warmth to help keep it going. It'll make it want to drink more milk. The way that you'll prevent the lamb from drinking too much is by keeping it in front of them all the time, right? If we have a buffet sitting next to us all the time, right, we're going to go and grab a slice of pizza or a cheeseburger intermittently throughout the day. Versus if we haven't eaten all day and we're really hungry, we're more likely to go up there and grab the whole pizza and bring it back and eat it, right? Same thing with the lambs. We don't want them to gorge themselves when they eat. So if we can keep warm milk in front of them all the time, that is the goal. Same thing when we switch to the cold milk. We want to keep the milk, as long as we're offering it to them free choice, and by free choice we mean in front of them all the time. It's important, we will avoid the problem of overeating. Can you suggest? Do you suggest creep feeding for all lambs, not just bottle fed? I personally do. I'm not super familiar with what the Western range production looks like. Obviously, you're going to have added costs. I will say your weaning weights are going to be higher if you creep feed. Um, Again, I would really talk to the person that's more specialized, like Chad or Melinda, in your specific region. Um, Back where I'm from, we're pushing lambs. We want lambs to look as good as they can because we're selling to a way different market than what the commercial market is. So growth and is always a good thing for us, no matter how much cost we have to feed into it. So balancing that for your operation is important.
Hey
How do you
Clay.
effectively?
Hey Clay.
Yep. Yep.
I'm gonna help sift through some of these questions with you, okay? I'll help
Okay. Sounds
moderate a little
good.
bit if that's okay. Let
Yep.
me do a little plug on the creep feeding aspect also. Um, I think that a lot of operations, I mean, we know the majority of these commercial sheep are on range, so creep feeding isn't necessarily an option or infrastructure that we have. But for those of us that are able to actually raise at home and have creep feeding setups, or maybe we have a lambing shed, creep feeding does allow us to take advantage of when they're young, they have better feed efficiency. We can help develop that rumen a little bit earlier. And then it actually takes some stress off during the weaning time. So last week, if any of you joined us for the Q&A with the specialist. We had a veterinarian on from, Washington State University. We talked a little bit about creep feeding and some of the benefits of that. And so I'd say that there's some major benefits and there's always benefits, but we may not always have the infrastructure to do that. So you did have, I'm going to kind of summarize a couple questions for you, Clay. So there was a
Okay.
question about kind of creep feeding and development of that rumen a little bit. Can you kind of talk about that process of um, kind of the esophageal groove and how the abomasum and the rumen change size leading up to essentially coming off of milk and weaning time?
Yeah. So I wish I had a diagram in here to explain this to you, but we should be able to. I'll try and paint you a good picture, right? So our ruminant stomachs, we have those four compartments, right? Um, but when the lamb is born, we can kind of consider them to be monogastric or having a digestive tract that looks just like ours, right? What they eat is going directly to their stomach. There's no fermentation going on beforehand. Um, so it's just going right to the stomach. What we can do with the creep feed is now start introducing, things like when they break that down, they'll make something called volatile fatty acids that can stimulate the rumen wall to develop. This isn't really my area of like great expertise, but what I will say is that the more so the lamb's esophageal groove and their monogastric, nature when they're born, as they get older, will naturally start to change with age. Um, and we can promote better rumen growth, promote the rest of that tract to grow with things like creep feed. We're not going to change really the size, that's kind of preset. What we can change is the development of the wall and how efficient those stomachs are, but we're not really going to change the shape of them or anything like that. Chad, you might add in there. Hopefully that kind of answered
Yeah,
the
the
question.
question was a little bit on the actual capacity change, but I think it leads into another question of in your project, did you do any necropsies of animals at all to look at that gut wall, or it was a live animal study that we kept everything alive, right?
Yep. Yeah, it was only live animal. We didn't really have funding to go and be doing any necropsies or anything like that. It would have been interesting to see maybe some future work that we could do, but no, we did not look at anything like that.
Okay. Do you have any preferences on creep feeds as far as texture or pelleted versus, size, any of those types of things?
Yeah. So it's kind of an interesting area. Um, I know a lot of people that put one bin of pelleted. completely pelleted creep feed in, and one bin of texturized creep feed in. And 1 week the lambs will eat more of the pelleted, and the next week they'll eat more of the textured. I don't know if there's a real rhyme or reason to which one is more palatable. My preference has always been on the textured side of things, because where we're at, we have a lot of grain mills, and it's really easy to get that sort of thing. But if you're obviously out on range, or have your lambing shed, and there's the nearest cornfield is 500 or 600 miles away, um, you don't have that luxury. So I would not be scared if it's cheaper cost wise. It makes more sense for you to use a pelleted feed as your creep.
Okay. You have a question that asks, other than the cost of milk replacer, which is a lot, right? Is there
Yeah.
any uh pros or cons really of keeping them on milk longer, like
Yeah. So the
3 or more months?
yeah. So the biggest risk that you're going to run into keeping them on milk longer is what we call abomasal bloat, right? By the time that lamb is 30 days old and we've been bottle feeding it for that long, we really want to start pushing it towards more of an adult diet, right? They're made, obviously the lactation curve, and how long those lambs are suckling on range ewes looks a lot different than what we're doing in confinement. Um, but you know, the udder on, I would speculate that the udder on your range ewes, the amount of milk that they're producing as that time goes on is getting less and less. Um, so it doesn't make as much sense to keep on feeding those, I mean, those minuscule amounts of milk, I would say, later on, when you can get them switched over and off of milk sooner. The abomasal bloat issue occurs when they drink too much of that milk and it all goes right to their abomasum. You can actually get them to have a lot of like stomach digestive issues. They'll get a lot of Clostridial bacteria that can cause disease that way. So that's kind of the big concern. Obviously, the cost, but then also really the risk for abomasal bloat really starts to go up the longer you keep them on milk replacer.
Yeah. And I have a story about that. I actually had someone talk to me about this issue, and they had kept their bottle lamb on milk for a very significant amount of time, like 3, 4 months on just milk without any access to anything else. And by that point, you haven't helped that rumen develop at all. And so when you go back to those pictures that Clay showed of no papillae development on a purely a milk diet, transitioning to a normal feed was at that point almost irreversible. And so that individual tried to slowly, mix some milk with some alfalfa pellets and, tried to do things, but ultimately that lamb ended up being a very poor doer and that actually ended up dying. Now, they said it was from something else, but I'm sure the inability to process feed was not helping the situation. And so when you think about even confinement operation like Clay is talking about, or versa range operation, the difference with those ewes that have lambs on them, those lambs have access to the same feed their parents do, whether it's at the feed bunk or out on range on a pasture. And so they're starting to consume that in small amounts and helping to develop that rumen, even if they didn't have access to a specific creep feed, right? But when we have our orphaned lambs or our bottled lambs, oftentimes we stick them in a pen with nothing. And so it's hard for them to develop unless you very purposefully put creep or feed in front of them for that to start to develop. And so it's pretty crucial that we don't keep them on milk for a very long time as their sole diet. So, um, okay, so we have a couple other questions that are popping up. So have you heard about feeding a single bottle lamb by hand? Should you keep that nipple at the same height as the teats or the rumen, or bypass that? And I think you can I think this can kind of go to answering that question of, is there benefit to making more vigorous sucking action, or maybe it being easier for them to drink out of that bottle? You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yep. So there's a lot of research out there in the calf side of things that suggests that getting the lamb to actually get or getting the calf down to the right height and suckling versus holding it up higher is good for them. I will say that, just from my experience handling those lambs, um, if you're having one that's hard to suck, one of the easiest things to do when you have the bottle in its mouth is push its head down towards the ground. It almost just triggers that lamb to go, all right, I'm supposed to be suckling right now. So you can give them you can really increase the aggressiveness of their suckling behavior by keeping your bottle head lower. Once they're trained to suck off the nipple, whether it has any long-term effects, like when they're 2 or 3 weeks old, I'm not really sure if there's any research out there in that area. But I will say it is really helpful when it comes to training them. If you're keeping it at the same height as the thing that their instincts are already telling them that they should be looking for.
Um, so post weaning, do you have any recommendations for types of dry hay? Um, alfalfa or lower quality hay, grass hay, or anything like that?
I personally don't. We here at the unit utilized alfalfa hay. Um, it really just depends on, keeping in mind the requirements of the lamb and what your lambs are eating. If you're trying to prepare a lamb to go get turned out on the range, you probably don't want to get it used to living the life of eating a luxury alfalfa type diet. But if you're somebody who's in, confinement and you're thinking about feeding those lambs pretty, grain heavy ration to push them to that finishing weight as fast as possible. Then switching towards something like that is probably, using a higher energy or higher concentrated um, diet on the hay side of things can be useful. Really just depends on what you're doing, which, the thing that I will say that you should do, if available, use your long stem fiber sources. So use whole hay instead of, cubes or pellets. Obviously, that might not be doable for everybody, but that would be my recommendation.
Yeah, I think there's something to say about a roughage on the interaction with the rumen wall and helping development and satiety and things like that. So there's a lot of good benefits on actually having ruminants eat roughage, right? What they were designed to do. Um, One individual has a 36-year-old Nubian kid, so goats here, who prefer to drink milk out of a bowl over nursing. Could this be a red flag? Is that a problem at all?
I'm not sure. Goats are not my specialty. I'll say that. I would say as long as they're drinking the milk, it's probably not an issue. I mean, if we look at what they do on dairy farms, the first thing that we do to those calves is try and get them trained to drink off of a bucket instead of a nipple, right? So it's probably not that big of a problem. I mean, obviously, as long as we're watching its intake and making sure it's drinking, probably not going to be not that big of an issue for us.
Okay. Well, we do need to wrap up, so I'm going to answer one question for you, and then I'm going to throw our last question at you, Clay. Thank you for your time today.
Yep.
So one of your questions was, will these slides be sent out? Our collaboration for this sheep and goat webinar, we generally record these lectures, and then they're posted on the University of Idaho Livestock Extension YouTube page. So you can go ahead and find Clay and this information there after a moment of time. And if not, you can feel free to email Clay directly and
Yep.
talk to him or any of us on the webinar series. One of the last ones that actually was one of our first questions um, that I think you could kind of go into a little bit again is that first question of, you know, can we give colostrums from goats to sheep? And then I think we'll end it on there.
Yeah, we can. Is it going to be as good as giving the colostrum from a ewe? Probably not. The other thing to keep in mind, diseases, making sure that, you're not feeding any sort of colostrum from a group of goats that might introduce any sort of, zoonotic disease to your sheep. Um, that's not really my area of specialty, knowing what diseases goats kind of pass over to sheep. I kind of think of sheep solely, in most of my day-to-day life. Um, yes, you can. Is it as good as like we talked about with the IgG molecule with the dairy, as good as getting helping out the sheep immune system as a sheep IgG molecule would be? Probably not. Um, but it's better than nothing, right? So that's my take on it.
Yeah, I think as a rule of thumb, a lot of us, will agree that species specific is best, especially if it's on your operation, right? So if you have a ewe who lost a lamb and you have the ability to collect her colostrum and store it, that is like the most ideal, even beyond commercially bought colostrum, right? But maybe a goat, right, that lives on your same operation that is exposed to the same things that isn't immunocompromised with another disease, that colostrum may give antibodies that that are needed for your environment a little bit better than a commercial, but is still not as good as colostrum itself. And so uh, there's a little bit of nuance there, but I think the main thing is, like Clay said, is get colostrum in them, right? It's kind of the take home story. So, okay, well,
Yep.
oh, go ahead.
So I was gonna say I just put my email in the chat. Hopefully all of you guys can see it. If you have any more questions, feel free to reach out to me that way. I'll also be happy to share the slides with you via email too, if you'd like to have those.
Okay. Well, with that, thank you very much, Clay. Look forward to seeing you in the sheep industry as time goes on, and good luck with everything at South Dakota State University. Thank you very
Awesome.
much.
Yep. Thank you
Um,
guys for
Yep. So you can find this webinar video posted on the University of Idaho YouTube Extension Livestock page, along with all our other videos given by scientists and producers and experts within the field from across the United States. Some really good videos out there. And so if you do have questions about different topics, feel free to look up those videos, and I'm sure there's everything from coccidia to proper vaccination timing and protocol. So good luck this lambing season, and we look forward to seeing you again next month. Thank you.